Impressionism, which emerged in the 1870s, had a significant impact throughout Europe and beyond, with Impressionist-influenced art movements developing around the world and persisting throughout the 20th century, particularly in landscape painting. In South Africa, Impressionist influences began to make themselves felt around the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. The Impressionist approach to landscape was rich in potential for South African artists who wished to transform the way their own land was represented in art, and became particularly associated with artists in and around Cape Town and the Western Cape, where there was a well-developed and varied artistic community. The first part of this video explored this early history of what became known as Cape Impressionism. This second part continues the story to the 1980s, as the Cape Impressionist tradition became a firmly established aspect of the arts in South Africa, but also faced challenges as artistic approaches and traditions changed and evolved. In July 1930, an exhibition of work by modern South African artists was held at the Burlington Gallery in Cape Town, the first of a planned regular series of exhibitions devoted to contemporary art. The art critic of the Cape Times welcomed the idea. Art does not flourish in lonely places. It requires the stimulus of the clash of minds, the jostle of ideas. It benefits, strange to say, by comparisons. Nothing serves it better than constant exhibition. The point is that the public will, in the long run, add a stimulus to your work which few can afford to disregard. I make no doubt that the present show, the first of its kind in Cape Town so far as I know, will provide that stimulus. It is certainly needed. The exhibition combined professional artists with amateurs of varying degrees of skill. Some of the exhibitors are still significant names in South African art history today, while others are now obscure or completely forgotten. As the Times critic said, the hope was that this exhibition would both stimulate South African artists and increase interest in the arts across the country. Despite much improvement since the turn of the century, with more towns and cities now having public art galleries and art schools, the South African arts world remained small, inward-looking and rather isolated from wider artistic trends. The art-buying public was small. There were few institutions supporting the arts, and South Africa still seemed to have no characteristic style of its own. Even in Cape Town, recognized as the center of artistic activity in South Africa and home of the country's new National Gallery, the need for change was increasingly felt. The gallery's inaugural exhibition in November 1930, for example, was harshly criticized for disregarding South African artists in favor of artists from Britain, whose work was allowed to dominate the show. However, that desire for change did not necessarily mean an attitude of openness to new artistic developments, particularly if they were radical or modernist in character. The South African arts establishment remained largely traditionalist in their views. Cape Impressionism was, by 1930, a well-established part of the South African visual arts, but the place it occupied was ambiguous. It was inspired by the techniques and styles of the European 19th-century Impressionists, and was thus innately conservative and derivative, but was taken up by a younger generation of artists who wanted to challenge the status quo and create a new and transformative South African artistic voice. Impressionism played a large role in landscape painting, and landscape had long been seen as key to the generation of a distinctively South African school of visual art. In 1917, the landscape painter Edward Roworth wrote the following: "Apart from the Cape Peninsula, which contains perhaps the most varied scenery of the Union, but is not, strictly speaking, at all typical of South Africa, the features of our land are mainly three: monotony, size, and light. The eloquence of vast monotony, of vast distance is almost impossible to convey on canvas. But in the South African school of the future, there can be little doubt that something of this sombre and strange attraction will steep itself in its art. The artists now at work understand the limitations of Impressionism, and where one feels the spirit of Africa in their work, one feels it more in the underlying emotion than in the presentation of typical scenes. National feeling does not display itself by outward signs so much as by something deep and ingrained, which only emerges in hints and glimpses. You may remember Roeth from the first part of this film as a bastion of conservatism in the South African arts, but earlier in his career he was strongly associated with Impressionism, and indeed was criticized for painting in this style. Impressionist techniques and approaches naturally opened the South African artists who adopted them to the same criticisms which had been faced by their European counterparts, that their work was rough, unfinished, unskilled. In the Cape Times review of the 1930 exhibition, two Cape Impressionist artists in particular, Gregoire Bonzaïr and Hugo Naudé, attracted this hostility. Bonzaïr was criticized for his lack of clean colour and his tendency to spill all his paints into the gutter before beginning on a canvas, while Naudé's work was dismissed as dull and flat. He seems to achieve colour without light. You wonder that so much colour can be so flat. The critique was not necessarily of style, but of the level of accomplishment. These two artists, Bonzaïr and Naudé, would go on to be recognized as among the most important South African artists of the 20th century. When the most notable challenge to the South African artistic establishment emerged in the late 1930s in the form of the new group, Cape Impressionism was an important element in its formation. Several leading new group artists were best known for their landscape painting, and there were significant figures involved with the group who provide a link with the Cape Impressionist school, notably Gregoire Bonzaïr, who was the group's leader, Terence McCaw, and Frida Locke. These artists formed the core of the later generation of Cape Impressionists. Gregoire Bonzaïr was already an established artist in the Cape when he travelled to London in his mid-20s to study at the Heatherley School of Art and the Central School of Art and Design. By the time Bonzaïr returned to South Africa in 1937, he was thoroughly imbued with contemporary European tendencies in painting, such as post-impressionism and fauvism, and was determined to bring his insights to South African subjects and create a modern and distinctive South African artistic voice. It was this ambition that led him to take a leading role in the new group, with which he was involved until it dissolved in 1953. As a landscapist, Bonzaïr continually experimented and innovated, using rich colour palettes, vigorous brushstrokes, showing a more and more post-impressionist character, and breaking up landscape forms until they became almost abstract. It is in the work of his early and mid-career, when impressionist influences are at their clearest in his concern to capture the sensory experience of a scene at a particular moment, that his work was at its freshest and most influential. Frida Locke studied at Heatherley's with Bonzaïr, and her work shows a similar impressionist-influenced concern with light and colour, but post-impressionist influences are stronger in her work from an earlier stage, particularly the influence of Van Gogh. Locke was particularly celebrated for her interiors, emphasizing the point that while landscapes remained the dominant theme in South African impressionist-influenced art, other themes, such as the interior and the still life, were of great importance in the middle decades of the 20th century. Another artist who created influential still lifes in an impressionist and arguably post-impressionist style was Strat Caldecott, with works such as The Sideboard, probably painted in the mid-1920s. Caldecott died relatively young in 1929, so did not contribute directly to the continuing development of Cape Impressionism, but his works remained influential for their blending of European Impressionism with authentically South African light, settings, and atmosphere. A reviewer in the Cape Argus of 26 January 1925 wrote that Mr. Caldecott is an Impressionist, and when he is striving to reproduce the effect the suddenly glimpsed picture has on him, he does not suffer himself to be held back by form, but relies on light and life and colour to give the desired effect. A similar focus on light and life and colour, and an example of the intersecting influence of French Impressionism and the British Post-Impressionism of the London group, can be seen in the work of Terence McCaw. This 1938 painting, Homestead, has clear echoes of Van Gogh in both composition and technique, and gives its humble subject a monumentality that also suggests early works by Van Gogh. The colour choices convey the atmosphere of the South African setting. An artist who chose a more restrained style of Impressionist-influenced landscape was the British-born painter Robert Broadley, who was in fact best known for his portraiture and figurative painting. His brushwork is loose and expressive, but the subdued tonality of his palette gives his works a cooler and calmer air than those of many of his South African contemporaries, suggesting the direct application of a Northern European Impressionism to local subjects. This relatively conventional approach made Broadley's work more acceptable to the South African arts establishment. His work was readily acquired by galleries and exhibited during the 1930s and 40s, and retained its popularity into the 1960s and 70s. The painter David Botha followed a similar trajectory, bringing the Cape Impressionist tradition into the 1980s. By the period from the early 1970s to the late 1980s, the legacy of Cape Impressionism had become absorbed into a thriving but in many respects conventionalized South African landscape tradition. But, in the hands of an accomplished practitioner such as Piet van Heerden, even more conventional Impressionism-influenced works could retain their freshness and convey an authentically South African atmosphere. In his later works, the forms of landscape are so refined to their essence as to become almost abstracted, echoing an approach which can also be found in the works of J. H. Pierneef, an artist who had long pursued his own path and left any influences of Cape Impressionism behind to present a starker vision of the South African landscape, focused on the forces of nature rather than human perceptions. This move towards abstraction also creates a connection with some of the landscape paintings of the later 1950s and 1960s by Herbert Coetzee, and also to the Cubist-influenced and semi-abstract landscapes of that era by Grégoire Bonsaïr, who brings us back full circle. Cape Impressionism emerged as a challenge to the South African arts establishment in the early 20th century, and played an important part in the development of a characteristically South African artistic style over the following decades. Many artists in South Africa could be said, to varying degrees, to have been associated with Cape Impressionism. I have only been able to talk briefly about very few of them in these videos. But Cape Impressionism was an innately conservative artistic movement, and its conservatism persisted, even as some of the artists associated with it moved into more radical styles of art. Impressionism itself, overtaken in Europe and North America by Post-Impressionism, Expressionism, and various forms of abstraction and modernism, had lost its association with innovation and experimentation by the period of the First World War. The picturesque aesthetics of Cape Impressionism eased its absorption into the South African artistic mainstream. Work by the more conventional artists identified as Cape Impressionists was readily acquired by the South African National Gallery during the 1930s, and the Impressionist-influenced techniques and aesthetics pioneered by artists such as Nita Spielhaus and Pieter Venning in the late 19th and early 20th centuries became a recognized part of the South African landscape tradition. By the 1930s and 1940s, it had become less relevant, caught between the development of newly radical styles in South Africa and the continuing reactionary posture of the South African arts establishment. But by this time, Cape Impressionism had won a secure, popular following, both among the art-buying public and artists themselves, and the style remained a recognized and active part of South Africa's artistic landscape from the 1950s and 60s onwards. In the 1980s, the art historian Esmé Berman wrote in her Art and Artists of South Africa that there were enough artists practicing Cape Impressionism to justify formal adoption of the term to connote a particular category of South African painting. This category retains its popularity today. Thus, Cape Impressionism had become, by the late 20th century, one of the essential foundations of what artists in the earlier part of the century had been seeking, a distinctively South African artistic vision.